Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Boeing 747. The Boeing 747 is an American wide-body commercial jet airliner and cargo aircraft, often referred to by its original nickname Jumbo Jet. Its distinctive hump, upper deck along the forward part of the aircraft makes it among the world's most recognizable aircraft, and it was the first wide-body manufactured by Boeing's commercial airplane unit in the United States. The original version of the 747 was envisioned to have 150% greater capacity than the Boeing 707, one of the common large commercial aircraft of the 1960s. First flown commercially in 1970, the 747 held the passenger capacity record for 37 years. The four-engine 747 uses a double-deck configuration for part of its length. It is available in passenger freighter and other versions. Boeing designed the 747's hump-like upper deck to serve as a first-class lounge or extra seating, and to allow the aircraft to be easily converted to a cargo carrier by removing seats and installing a front cargo door. Boeing did so because the company expected supersonic airliners to render the 747 and other subsonic airliners obsolete, while the demand for subsonic cargo aircraft would be robust well into the future. The 747 was expected to become obsolete after 400 were sold, but it exceeded critics' expectations, with production passing the 1,000 mark in 1993. By September 2017, 1,536 aircraft had been built, with 17 of the 747 8 variants remaining on order. The 747 has been involved in 60 hull losses, resulting in fatalities. The 747-400, the most common passenger version in service, has a high subsonic cruise speed of Mach 0.850-0.855, with an intercontinental range of 7,260 nautical miles. The 747-400 passenger version can accommodate 416 passengers in a typical 3-class layout, 524 passengers in a typical 2-class layout, or 660 passengers in a high-density 1-class configuration. The newest version of the aircraft, the 747-8, is in production and received certification in 2011. Deliveries of the 747-8F freighter version began in October 2011. Deliveries of the 747-8I passenger version began in May 2012. Background. In 1963, the United States Air Force started a series of study projects on a very large strategic transport aircraft. Although the C-141 Starlifter was being introduced, they believed that a much larger and more capable aircraft was needed, especially the capability to carry outsized cargo that would not fit in any existing aircraft. These studies led to initial requirements for the CX Heavy Logistics System in March 1964 for an aircraft with a load capacity of 180,000 pounds and a speed of Mach 0.75 and an unrefueled range of 5,000 nmi, with a payload of 115,000 pounds. The payload bay had to be 17 feet wide by 13.5 feet high and 100 feet long, with access through doors at the front and rear, featuring only 4 engines. The design also required new engine designs with greatly increased power and better fuel economy. In May 1964, airframe proposals arrived from Boeing, Douglas, General Dynamics, Lockheed, and Martin Marietta. Engine proposals were submitted by General Electric, Curtiss-Wright, and Pratt, and Lockheed were given additional study contracts for the airframe along with General Electric. and Pratt. All three of the airframe proposals shared a number of features, as the CX-HLS needed to be able to be loaded from the front or had to be included where the cockpit usually was. All of the companies solved this problem by moving the cockpit above the cargo area. Douglas had a small pod just forward and above the wing. Lockheed used a long spine running the length of the aircraft with the wing spar passing through it, while Boeing blended the two with a longer pod that ran from just behind the nose to just behind the wing. In 1965, Lockheed's aircraft design and General Electric's engine design were selected for the new C-5 Galaxy transport, which was the largest military aircraft in the world at the time. The nose door and raised cockpit concepts would be carried over to the design of the 747 Airliner proposal. The 747 was conceived while air travel was increasing in the 1960s, the era of commercial jet transportation led by the enormous popularity of the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 had revolutionized long-distance travel. Even before it lost the CX-HLS contract, Boeing was asked by Juan Trippe, president of Pan American World Airways, one of their most important airline customers, to build a passenger aircraft more than twice the size of the 707. During this time, airport congestion worsened by increasing numbers of passengers carried on relatively small aircraft. Became a problem that Trippe thought could be addressed by a larger new aircraft. In 1965, Joe Sutter was transferred from Boeing's 737 development team to manage the design studies for the new airliner, already assigned the model number 747. Sutter initiated a design study with Pan Am and other airlines to better understand their requirements. At the time, it was widely thought that the 747 would eventually be superseded by supersonic transport aircraft. Boeing responded by designing the 747 so that it could be adapted easily to carry freight and remain in production even if sales of the passenger version declined. In the freighter role, the clear need was to support the containerized shipping methodologies that were being widely introduced. At about the same time, standard containers are 8 feet square at the front and available in 20 and lengths. This meant that it would be possible to support a 2-wide 2-high stack of containers 2 or 3 ranks deep, with a fuselage size similar to the earlier CX-HLS project. In April 1966, Pan Am ordered 25,747,100 aircraft for $525 million. During the ceremonial 747 contract signing banquet in Seattle on Boeing's 50th anniversary, Juan Trippe predicted that the 747 would be a great weapon for peace, competing with intercontinental missiles for mankind's destiny as launch customer, and because of its early involvement before placing a formal order, Pan Am was able to influence the design and development of the 747 to an extent unmatched by a single airline before or since. Design effort. Ultimately, the high-winged CX-HLS Boeing design was not used for the 747. Although technologies developed for their bid had an influence, the original design included a full-length double-deck fuselage with 8 across seating and 2 aisles on the lower deck and 7 across seating and 2 aisles on the upper deck. However, concern over evacuation routes and limited cargo carrying capability caused this idea to be scrapped in early 1966 in favor of a wider single-deck design. The cockpit was therefore placed on a shortened upper deck so that a freight loading door could be included in the nose cone. This design feature produced the 747's distinctive bulge. In early models, it was not clear what with a small space in the pod behind the cockpit, and this was initially specified as a lounge area, with no permanent seating. One of the principal technologies that enabled an aircraft as large as the 747 to be drawn up was the high bypass turbofan engine. The engine technology was thought to be capable of delivering double the power of the earlier turbojets while consuming a third less fuel. General Electric had pioneered the concept but was committed to developing the engine for the C-5 Galaxy and did not enter the commercial market until later. Pratt & Pratt. The project was designed with a new methodology called fault tree analysis, which allowed the effects of the failure of a single part to be studied to determine its impact on other systems. To address concerns about safety and flyability, the 747's design included structural redundancy, redundant hydraulic systems, quadruple main landing gear, and dual control surfaces. Additionally, some of the most advanced high-lift devices used in the industry were included in the new design to allow it to operate from existing airports. These included slats running almost the entire length of the wing, as well as complex three-part slotted flaps along the trailing edge of the wing. The wing's complex three-part flaps increase wing area by 21% and lift by 90% when fully deployed compared to their non-deployed configuration. Boeing agreed to deliver the first 747 to Pan Am by the end of 1969. The delivery date left 28 months to design the aircraft, which was two-thirds of the normal time. The schedule was so fast-paced that the people who worked on it were given the nickname The Incredibles. Developing the aircraft was such a technical and financial challenge that management was said to have bet the company when it started the project. Production plant. As Boeing did not have a plant large enough to assemble the giant airliner, they chose to build a new plant. The company considered locations in about 50 cities and eventually decided to build the new plant some 30 miles north of Seattle on a site adjoining a military base at Payne Field near Everett, Washington. It bought the 780-acre site in June 1966. Developing the 747 had been a major challenge, and building its assembly plant was also a huge undertaking. Boeing President William M. Allen asked Malcolm T. Stamper, then head of the company's turbine division, to oversee construction of the Everett factory and to start production of the 747. To level the site, more than 4 E6 CUID of earth had to be moved. Time was so short that the 747's full-scale mock-up was built before the factory roof above it was finished. The plant is the largest building by volume ever built, and has been substantially expanded several times to permit construction of other models of Boeing wide-body commercial jets. Development and testing. Before the first 747 was fully assembled, testing began on many components and systems. One important test involved the evacuation of 560 volunteers from a cabin mock-up via the aircraft's emergency chutes. The first full-scale evacuation took 2.5 minutes instead of the maximum of 90 seconds mandated by the Federal Aviation Administration, and several volunteers were injured. Subsequent test evacuations achieved the 90-second goal but caused more injuries. Most problematic was evacuation from the aircraft's upper deck. Instead of using a conventional slide, volunteer passengers escaped by using a harness attached to a reel. Tests also involved taxiing such a large aircraft. Boeing built an unusual training device known as Waddell's wagon that consisted of a mock-up cockpit mounted on the roof of a truck. While the first 747s were still being built, the device allowed pilots to practice taxi maneuvers from a high upper deck position. On September 30, 1968, the first 747 was rolled out of the Everett Assembly Building before the world's press and representatives of the 26 airlines that had ordered the Airliner. Over the following months, preparations were made for the first flight, which took place on February 9, 1969. With test pilots Jack Waddell and Brian Wiggle at the controls and Jess Wallach at the flight engineers station. Despite a minor problem with one of the flaps, the flight confirmed that the 747 handled extremely well. The 747 was found to be largely immune to Dutch roll, a phenomenon that had been a major hazard to the early swept-wing jets. During later stages of the flight test program, flutter testing showed that the wings suffered oscillation under certain conditions. This difficulty was partly solved by reducing the stiffness of some wing components. However, a particularly severe high-speed flutter problem was solved only by inserting depleted uranium counterweights as ballast in the outboard engine nacelles of the early 747s. This measure caused anxiety when these aircraft crashed, for example El Al Flight 1862 at Amsterdam in 1992 with 282 kilograms of uranium in the tailplane. The flight test program was hampered by problems with the 747's JT9D engines. Difficulties included engine stalls caused by rapid throttle movements, and distortion of the turbine casings after a short period of service. The problems delayed 747 deliveries for several months. Up to 20 aircraft at the Everett plant were stranded while awaiting engine installation. The program was further delayed when one of the 5 test aircraft suffered serious damage during a landing attempt at Renton Municipal Airport, site of the company's Renton factory. On December 13, 1969, a test aircraft was being taken to have test equipment removed and a cabin installed when pilot Ralph C. Coakley undershot the airport's short runway. The 747's right outer landing gear was torn off and 2 engine nacelles were damaged. However, these difficulties did not prevent Boeing from taking a test aircraft to the 28th Paris Air Show in mid-1969, where it was displayed to the public for the first time. The 747 received its FAA airworthiness certificate in December 1969, clearing it for introduction into service. The huge cost of developing the 747 and building the Everett factory meant that Boeing had to borrow heavily from a banking syndicate. During the final months before delivery of the first aircraft, the company had to repeatedly request additional funding to complete the project. Had this been refused, Boeing's survival would have been threatened. The firm's debt exceeded $2 billion, with the $1.2 billion owed to the banks setting a record for all companies. Allen later said, "It was really too large a project for us." Ultimately the gamble succeeded, and Boeing held a monopoly in very large passenger aircraft production for many years. Entry into service. On January 15, 1970, First Lady of the United States Pat Nixon christened Pan Am's first 747 at Dulles International Airport in the presence of Pan Am Chairman Najib Halabi. Instead of champagne, red, white and blue water was sprayed on the aircraft. The 747 entered service on January 22, 1970 on Pan Am's New York-London route. The flight had been planned for the evening of January 21. But engine overheating made the original aircraft unusable. Finding a substitute delayed the flight by more than 6 hours to the following day, when Clipper Victor was used. The 747 enjoyed a fairly smooth introduction into service, overcoming concerns that some airports would not be able to accommodate an aircraft that large. Although technical problems occurred, they were relatively minor and quickly solved. After the aircraft's introduction with Pan Am, other airlines that had bought the 747 to stay competitive began to put their own 747s into service. Boeing estimated that half of the early 747 sales were to airlines desiring the aircraft's long range rather than its payload capacity. While the 747 had the lowest potential operating cost per seat, this could only be achieved when the aircraft was fully loaded. Costs per seat increased rapidly as occupancy declined. A moderately loaded 747, one with only 70% of its seats occupied, used more than 95% of the fuel needed by a fully occupied 747. Nonetheless, many flag carriers purchased the 747 due to its iconic status, even if it made no sense economically to operate. During the 1970s and 1980s, there was often over 30 regularly scheduled 747s at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The recession of 1969-1970 greatly affected Boeing. For the year and a half after September 1970, it only sold 2 747s in the world and did not sell any to an American carrier for almost 3 years. When economic problems in the United States and other countries after the 1973 oil crisis led to reduced passenger traffic, several airlines found they did not have enough passengers to fly the 747 economically, and they replaced them with a smaller and recently introduced McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and Lockheed L-1011 tri-star trijet wide-bodies, having tried replacing coach seats on its 747s with piano bars in an attempt to attract more customers. American Airlines eventually relegated its 747s to cargo service and in 1983 exchanged them with Pan Am for smaller aircraft. Delta Airlines also removed its 747s from service after several years. Later, Delta acquired 747s again in 2008 as part of its merger with Northwest Airlines, although it intends to retire them from service by 2018. International flights that bypassed traditional hub airports and landed at smaller cities became more common throughout the 1980s, and this eroded the 747's original market. However, many international carriers continued to use the 747 on Pacific routes. In Japan, 747s on domestic routes were configured to carry close to the maximum passenger capacity. Improved 747 versions. After the initial 747,100, Boeing developed the higher maximum takeoff weight variant, and the with higher passenger capacity. Increased maximum takeoff weight allows aircraft to carry more fuel and have longer range. The model followed in 1971, featuring more powerful engines and a higher MTOW. Passenger freighter and combination passenger freighter versions of the were produced. The shortened 747 SP, with a longer range, was also developed and entered service in 1976. The 747 line was further developed with the launch of the 747-300 in 1980. The 300 series resulted from Boeing studies to increase the seating capacity of the 747, during which modifications such as fuselage plugs and extending the upper deck over the entire length of the fuselage were ejected. The first 747-300 completed in 1983 included a stretched upper deck, increased cruise speed and increased seating capacity. The 300 variant was previously designated 747 SUD for stretched upper deck, then 747-200 SUD followed by 747 EUD before the 747,300 designation was used. Passenger short-range, and combination freighter passenger versions of the 300 series were produced. In 1985, development of the longer-range 747,400 began. The variant had a new glass cockpit which allowed for a cockpit crew of 2 instead of 3, new engines, lighter construction materials, and a redesigned interior. Development costs soared, and production delays occurred as new technologies were incorporated at the request of airlines. Insufficient workforce experience and reliance on overtime contributed to early production problems on the 747,400. The 400 entered service in 1989. In 1991, a record-breaking 1,087 passengers were airlifted aboard a 747 to Israel as part of Operation Solomon. The 747 remained the heaviest commercial aircraft in regular service until the debut of the Antonov and 124 Ruslin in 1982. Variants of the 747,400 would surpass the N-124's weight in 2000. The Antonov and 225M rear cargo transport, which debuted in 1988, remains the world's largest aircraft by several measures. One aircraft has been completed and is in service. The Hughes H-4 Hercules is the largest aircraft by wingspan, but it only completed a single flight. Further developments. Since the arrival of the 747,400, several stretching schemes for the 747 have been proposed. Boeing announced the larger 747-500X and preliminary designs in 1996. The new variants would have cost more than $5 billion to develop, and interest was not sufficient to launch the program. In 2000, Boeing offered the more modest 747X and 747X stretch derivatives as alternatives to the Airbus A3XX. However, the 747X family was unable to attract enough interest to enter production. A year later, Boeing switched from the 747X studies to pursue the Sonic Cruiser, and after the Sonic Cruiser program was put on hold, the 787 Dreamliner. Some of the ideas developed for the 747X were used on the 747-400ER, a longer-range variant of the 747,400. After several variants were proposed but later abandoned, some industry observers became skeptical of new aircraft proposals from Boeing. However, in early 2004, Boeing announced tentative plans for the 747 Advanced that were eventually adopted. Similar in nature to the 747X, the stretched 747 Advanced used technology from the 787 to modernize the design and its systems. The 747 remained the largest passenger airliner in service until the Airbus A380 began airline service in 2007. On November 14, 2005, Boeing announced it was launching the 747 Advanced as the Boeing 747-8. The last 747-400s were completed in 2009. Most orders of the 747-8 have been for the freighter variant. On February 8, 2010, the 747-8 freighter made its maiden flight. The first delivery of the 747-8 went to Cargolux in 2011. The 1,500th produced Boeing 747 was delivered in June 2014. In January 2016, Boeing stated it was reducing 747-8 production to 6 a year beginning in September 2016. incurring a $569 million post-tax charge against its fourth quarter 2015 profits. At the end of 2015, the company had 20 orders outstanding. On January 29, 2016, Boeing announced that it had begun the preliminary work on the modifications to a commercial 747-8 for the next Air Force One presidential aircraft, expected to be operational by 2020. On July 12, 2016, Boeing announced that it had finalized terms of acquisition with Volga Dnepr Group for two 747-8 freighters valued at $7.58 billion at list prices. 4 aircraft were delivered. Beginning in 2012, Volga Dnepr Group is the parent of 3 major Russian air freight carriers: Volga Dnepr Airlines, Airbridge Cargo Airlines and Atran Airlines. The new 747-8 freighters will replace Airbridge Cargo's current 747,400 aircraft and expand the airline's fleet, and will be acquired through a mix of direct purchases and leasing over the next 6 years, Boeing said. On July 27, 2016, in its quarterly report to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Boeing discussed the potential termination of 747 production due to insufficient demand and market for the aircraft. With a firm order backlog of 21 aircraft and a production rate of 6 per year, program accounting has been reduced to 1,555 aircraft, and the 747 line could be closed in the third quarter of 2019. In October 2016, UPS Airlines ordered 14 8Fs to add capacity along with 14 options, which doubles its official backlog of 15, including some to refractory airlines, and could extend production by 2 more years. Design. The Boeing 747 is a large wide-body airliner with 4 wing-mounted engines. The wings have a high sweep angle of 37.5 degrees for a fast, efficient cruise of Mach 0.84 to 0.88. Depending on the variant, the sweep also reduces the wingspan, allowing the 747 to use existing hangars. Seating capacity is more than 366, with a 343-seat arrangement in economy class and a 232 arrangement in first class on the main deck. The upper deck has a 33-seat arrangement in economy class and a 22 arrangement in first class. Raised above the main deck, the cockpit creates a hump. The raised cockpit allows front-loading of cargo on freight variants. The upper deck behind the cockpit provides space for a lounge or extra seating. The stretched upper deck became available as an option on the 747-100B variant, and later as standard beginning on the 747-300. The upper deck was stretched more on the 747-8. The 747 cockpit roof section also has an escape hatch, from which crew can exit in the event of an emergency if they cannot exit through the cabin. The 747's maximum takeoff weight ranges from 735,000 pounds for the 100 to 970,000 pounds for the 8. Its range has increased from 5,300 nautical miles on the 100 to 8,000 nmi on the 8 high. The 747 has redundant structures along with 4 redundant hydraulic systems and 4 main landing gears with 4 wheels each, which provide a good spread of support on the ground and safety in case of tire blowouts. The main gear are redundant so that landing can be performed on 2 opposing landing gears if the others do not function properly. In addition, the 747 has split control surfaces and was designed with sophisticated triple-slotted flaps that minimize landing speeds and allow the 747 to use standard-length runways. for transportation of spare engines. 747s can accommodate a non-functioning fifth-pod engine under the port wing of the aircraft between the inner functioning engine and the fuselage. 747,100. The first 747-100s were built with 6 upper deck windows to accommodate upstairs lounge areas. Later, as airlines began to use the upper deck for premium passenger seating instead of lounge space, Boeing offered a 10-window upper deck as an option. Some early 100s were retrofitted with a new configuration. The 100 was equipped with Pratt. No freighter version of this model was developed, but many 747-100s were converted into freighters. A total of 167,747-100s were built. 747 SP. The development of the 747 SP stemmed from a joint request between Pan American World Airways and Iran Air, who were looking for a high-capacity airliner with enough range to cover Pan Am's New York Middle Eastern routes and Iran Air's planned Tehran-New York route. The Tehran-New York route, when launched, was the longest non-stop commercial flight in the world. The 747 SP is 48 feet shorter than the 747,100. Fuselage sections were eliminated fore and aft of the wing, and the center section of the fuselage was redesigned to fit mating fuselage sections. The SP's flaps used a simplified single-slotted configuration. The 747 SP, compared to earlier variants, had a tapering of the aft upper fuselage into the empennage, a double-hinged rudder, and longer vertical and horizontal stabilizers. Power was provided by Pratt. The 747 SP was granted a supplemental certificate on February 4, 1976, and entered service with launch customers Pan Am and Iran Air that same year. The aircraft was chosen by airlines wishing to serve major airports with short runways. A total of 45,747 SPs were built, with the 44th 747 SP delivered on August 30, 1982. In 1987, Boeing reopened the 747 SP production line after 5 years to build one last 747 SP for an order by the United Arab Emirates government. In addition to airline use, one 747 SP was modified for the NASA, German Aerospace Center Sophia experiment. Iran Air is the last civil operator of the type. Its final 747 SP was to be retired in June 2016. 747,200. While the 747,100 powered by Pratt for U.S. domestic operations, it was marginal for long international route sectors. The demand for longer-range aircraft with increased payload quickly led to the improved 200, which featured more powerful engines, increased MTOW, and greater range than the 100. A few early 200s retained the 3-window configuration of the 100 on the upper deck, but most were built with a 10-window configuration on each side. The 747,200 was produced in passenger freighter, convertible, and combi versions. The 747-200B was the basic passenger version, with increased fuel capacity and more powerful engines. It entered service in February 1971. In its first 3 years of production, the 200 was equipped with Pratt and increased to 6,000 nmi with later engines. Most 200Bs had an internally stretched upper deck, allowing for up to 16 passenger seats. The freighter model, the 747-200F, could be fitted with or without a side cargo door, and had a capacity of 105 tons and an MTOW of up to 833,000 pounds. It entered service in 1972 with Lufthansa. The convertible version, the 747-200C, could be converted between a passenger and a freighter, used in mixed configurations, and featured removable seats and a nose cargo door. The 200C could also be fitted with an optional side cargo door on the main deck. The combi model, the 747-200M, could carry freight in the rear section of the main deck via a side cargo door. A removable partition on the main deck separated the cargo area at the rear from the passengers. At the front, the 200M could carry up to 238 passengers in a three-class configuration, with cargo carried on the main deck. The model was also known as the 747-200 Combi. As on the 100, a stretched upper deck modification was later offered. A total of 10 converted 747-200s were operated by KLM. Union Day Transport Aériens also had 2 aircraft converted after launching the 200. With Pratt, 1972, Boeing announced that it had reached an agreement with General Electric to certify the 747 with CF650 series engines to increase the aircraft's market potential. Rolls-Royce followed 747 engine production with a launch order from British Airways for 4 aircraft. The option of RB211 524B engines was announced on June 17, 1975. The 200 was the first 747 to provide a choice of power plant from the 3 major engine manufacturers. A total of 393 of the 747,200 versions had been built when production ended in 1991. Of these, 225 were 200B-73, were 200 F-13, were 200 C-78, were 200M, and 4 were military. Many 747-200s remained in operation, although most large carriers have retired them from their fleets and sold them to smaller operators as of early 2000s. Large carriers have sped up fleet retirement following the September 11 attacks and the subsequent drop in demand for air travel, scrapping some and turning others into freighters. Iran Air retired the last passenger 747-200 in May 2016, 36 years after it was delivered. 747,400. The 747,400 is an improved model with increased range. It has wingtip extensions of 6 feet, and winglets of 6 feet, which improve the type's fuel efficiency by 4% compared to previous 747 versions. The 747,400 introduced a new glass cockpit designed for a flight crew of 2 instead of 3, with a reduction in the number of dials, gauges and knobs from 971 to 365 through the use of electronics. The type also features tail fuel tanks, revised engines and a new interior. The longer range has been used by some airlines to bypass traditional fuel stops such as anchorage. Power plants include the Pratt, General Electric CF680C2 and Rolls-Royce RB211 524. The was offered in passenger freighter, combi, domestic, extended range passenger and extended range freighter versions. Passenger versions retain the same upper deck as the, while the freighter version does not have an extended upper deck. The 747-400D was built for short-range operations with maximum seating for 624. Winglets were not included, but they can be retrofitted. Cruising speed is up to Mach 0.855 on different versions of the 747,400. The passenger version first entered service in February 1989, with launch customer Northwest Airlines on the Minneapolis to Phoenix route. The combi version entered service in September 1989 with KLM, while the freighter version entered service in November 1993 with Cargolix. The 747-400ERF entered service with Air France in October 2002, while the 747-400ER entered service with Qantas, its sole customer, in November 2002. In January 2004, Boeing and Cathay Pacific launched the Boeing 747-400 Special Freighter program, later referred to as the Boeing Converted Freighter, to modify passenger 747-400s for cargo use. The first 747-400 BCF was redelivered in December 2005. In March 2007, Boeing announced that it had no plans to produce further passenger versions of the 400. However, orders for 36 400F and 400ERF freighters were already in place at the time of the announcement. The last passenger version of the 747-400 was delivered in April 2005 to China Airlines. Some of the last-built 747-400s were delivered with Dreamliner livery, along with the modern signature interior from the Boeing 777. A total of 694 of the 747-400 series aircraft were delivered at various times. The largest 747-400 operator has included Singapore Airlines, Japan Airlines and British Airways, with 31. 747 LCF Dreamlifter. The 747-400 Dreamlifter is a Boeing-designed modification of existing 747-400s to a larger configuration to ferry 787 Dreamliner sub-assemblies. Evergreen Aviation Technologies Corporation of Taiwan was contracted to complete modifications of 747-400s into Dreamlifters in Taoyuan. The aircraft flew for the first time on September 9, 2006 in a test flight. Modification of 4 aircraft was completed by February 2010. The Dreamlifters have been placed into service transporting sub-assemblies for the 787 program to the Boeing plant in Everett, Washington for final assembly. The aircraft is certified to carry only essential crew and not passengers. 747 Trijet. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Boeing studied the development of a shorter 747 with 3 engines to compete with a smaller L-1011 TriStar and DC-10. The 747 Trijet would have had more payload range and passenger capacity than the L-1011 and DC-10. The center engine would have been fitted in the tail with an S-duct intake, similar to the L-1011's. However, engineering studies showed that a total redesign of the 747 wing would be necessary. Maintaining the same 747 handling characteristics would be important to minimize pilot retraining. Boeing decided instead to pursue a shortened 4-engine 747, resulting in the 747 SP. Operators. The last U.S. passenger Boeing 747 will be retired from Delta Airlines in December 2017, after it flew for every American major carrier since its 1970 introduction. Accidents and incidents. The 747 has been involved in 146 aviation accidents and incidents, including 61 accidents and hull losses which resulted in fatalities. The last crash was Turkish Airlines Flight 6491 in January 2017. There was also 24 deaths in 32 aircraft hijackings such as Pan Am Flight 73, where a Boeing 747-121 was hijacked by 4 terrorists and resulted in 20 deaths. Few crashes have been attributed to design flaws of the 747. The Tenerife airport disaster resulted from pilot error and communications failure, while the Japan Airlines Flight 123 and China Airlines Flight 611 crashes stemmed from improper aircraft repair. United Airlines Flight 811, which suffered an explosive decompression mid-flight on February 24, 1989, led the National Transportation Safety Board to issue a recommendation that 747,200 cargo doors similar to those on the Flight 811 aircraft be modified. Korean Airlines Flight 0007 was shot down by a Soviet fighter aircraft in 1983 after it had strayed into Soviet territory, causing U.S. President Ronald Reagan to authorize the then strictly military global positioning system for civilian use. Accidents due to design deficiencies included TWA Flight 800, where a 747,100 exploded in mid-air on July 17, 1996, probably due to sparking electricity wires inside the fuel tank. This finding led the FAA to propose a rule requiring installation of an inerting system in the center fuel tank of most large aircraft that was adopted in July 2008 after years of research into solutions. At the time, the new safety system was expected to cost $100,000 to $450,000 per aircraft, and weigh approximately 200 pounds. LL Flight 1862 crashed after the fuse pins for an engine broke off shortly after takeoff due to metal fatigue. Instead of dropping away from the wing, the engine knocked off the adjacent engine and damaged the wing. Other uses. Upon its retirement from service, the 747 No. 2 in the production line was dismantled and shipped to Hopyeong Namyangju, Gyeonggi-do, South Korea, where it was reassembled, repainted in a livery similar to that of Air Force One, and converted into a restaurant. Originally flown commercially by Pan Am as N747 PA Clipper 1T trip and repaired for service following a tail strike, it stayed with the airline until its bankruptcy. The restaurant closed by 2009 and the aircraft was scrapped in 2010. A former British Airways 747-200 BGBDXJ is parked at the Dunsfold Aerodrome in Surrey, England, and has been used as a movie set for productions such as the 2006 James Bond film Casino Royale. The plane also appears frequently in the BBC television series Top Gear, which is filmed at Dunsfold. The Jumbo Hostel, using a converted 747,200, opened at Arlanda Airport, Stockholm on January 15, 2009. The wings of a 747 have been recycled as roofs of a house in Malibu, California. Notable appearances in media. Following its debut, the 747 rapidly achieved iconic status, appearing in numerous film productions such as Airport 1975 and Airport 77 disaster films, Air Force One, Die Hard 2 and Executive Decision. Appearing in over 300 film productions, the 747 is one of the most widely depicted civilian aircraft, and is considered by many as one of the most iconic in film history. The aircraft entered the cultural lexicon as the original jumbo jet, a term coined by the aviation media to describe its size, and was also nicknamed Queen of the Skies. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?